Brazil, one of the most culturally diverse countries on Earth. A nation shaped by indigenous peoples, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and perhaps surprisingly, Japan. In fact, Brazil is home to what is the largest Japanese population outside of Japan. Over a century ago, ships carrying hopeful migrants crossed the Pacific, laying the foundations for tight-knit Japanese communities that still exist today. Their influence, it can be seen everywhere, from food and festivals to language and family names. But where people, money, and opportunity flow, something else often follows. Brazil's criminal underworld is just as diverse as its society. From homegrown gangs to international syndicates, it has long been somewhat of a crossroads for organized crime too. And hidden within this complex web is a story few people outside Brazil, and to an extent even in Brazil, rarely if ever speak about. A story that played out surprisingly low-key, surfacing not in dramatic shootouts, but in scattered headlines, court cases, and police investigations. This is how the Japanese Yakuza made it all the way to Brazil, how Asia's most infamous crime syndicate found a foothold in South America, how it intersected with the Japanese-Brazilian community, and how its presence challenged the idea that the Yakuza were ever confined to Japan alone. So, let's get into it. What better way to start this story than by asking the following question? How did the Japanese, of all people, end up in Brazil, of all places, in such staggering numbers? First off, let's talk some numbers. According to Japan's foreign ministry, around 3 million Nikkei, or people of Japanese descent, live in South America today. And of those 3 million, a jaw-dropping 2.7 million, or around 90%, live in Brazil. Most of them in the city of Sao Paulo alone, where estimates go as high as 1.6 million. That's not just a community, that, my friends, is a presence. Big enough for its own newspapers, its own schools, its own chamber of commerce, and of course, its own Japantown, Sao Paulo's famous Liberdade district. Now, if you're hearing this for the very first time, you're probably wondering, why Brazil? Fair question. It's not exactly next door to the land of the rising sun. Culturally, let's just say reserved minimalism and carnival samba, they don't immediately scream natural pairing. The answer, however, is actually pretty simple. Opportunity and money. On June 18th, 1908, the ship Kazatomaru arrived at the port of Santos carrying 719 Japanese farmers and their families, the first Japanese to arrive in Brazil. Brazil needed labor for its coffee plantations, Japan needed economic relief. The deal was struck, and it worked. Within just a few decades, the Japanese population in Brazil surged past the 100,000 mark. By the early 1930s, immigration had crossed 130,000. Over time, their descendants would have an impact on pretty much every aspect of life in Brazil. Cuisine, fashion, business, art, you name it. But those early decades, not all smooth sailing. Starting in 1938, Brazil's government restricted foreign communities from publishing in their own language or engaging in political life. Japanese immigration then halted entirely starting in 1941 when Japan entered World War II. Communication with the homeland was cut off, newspapers vanished, letters stopped arriving. And where information disappears, misinformation moves in. And so, after Japan's surrender in 1945, a Japanese-Brazilian Sao Paulo-based group called the Shindo Renmei began spreading a bold claim that Japan had never actually lost the war. With news from home blocked for years, many believed it. Those who didn't, labeled the Makegumi or defeatists, they were branded as traitors. And subsequently, between 1946 and 1947, 23 Japanese Brazilians lost their lives at the hands of the Shindo Renmei. Another 147 were wounded. In an April 1946 article, the New York Times described the Shindo Renmei as a continuation of Japan's ultra-nationalist Black Dragon Society, a name that longtime viewers of this channel might recognize. The Black Dragon Society played a not insignificant role in the development of Japan's early ultra-nationalist networks that would eventually intersect with the evolution of the modern Yakuza. And that's a good point to continue off of. Yes, political extremism from Japan had reached Brazil, something that the Yakuza know a thing or two about, but that still wasn't organized crime in the way we understand it. The Shindo Renmei certainly proved that turmoil from the homeland could take root overseas. It proved that ideology could travel. But what it did not prove was that Japan's criminal underworld had followed. So when did that happen exactly? Well, before the Japanese Yakuza could establish itself in Brazil, they needed a reason to look outward in the first place. In the years immediately following the war, Japan's organized crime groups were busy rebuilding. The war had disrupted everything, and it wasn't until the late 1960s that larger-scale Yakuza expansion beyond Japan really began. Hawaii, the US mainland. I've covered those in previous videos. And Brazil? Brazil totally made sense. Like those other aforementioned destinations, it had a large Japanese community. In fact, the largest outside Japan, as we established earlier. It was basically a ready-made cultural bridge, and a criminal one too. Now, compared to Hawaii especially, documentation of Yakuza activity in Brazil is spread a bit thinner. Still, scattered reports suggest that they had definitely established some kind of foothold there by the 1970s. By the 1970s, a new wave of Korean and Chinese immigration was reshaping Sao Paulo. In Liberdade especially, the district was becoming less of a residential enclave for the Japanese and more of a commercial hub, with many Japanese families moving out to other neighborhoods, even as they kept their businesses rooted in Liberdade. Japanese-owned shops were thriving, but competition was growing just as quickly. By the late 1970s, Brazilian media began reporting on tensions within the district, describing altercations between Korean merchants and young Japanese men whom members of the local Japanese community referred to as gurentai, or hoodlums. These members of the community are believed to have already been linked in some way to organized crime groups back in Japan. And like their counterparts in Japan, they too set up legitimate businesses as cover for criminal activities. Restaurants, bars, construction companies, and in Brazil's case, import-export shops. That last one is important. By the 70s and 80s, Japanese electronics were dominating global markets. Brazil, however, imposed extremely high taxes on foreign electronics. The result, huge demand for cheaper, unofficial imports. Moving goods out of Brazil was profitable, moving Japanese products in could be even more so. Other familiar revenue streams, illegal gambling, narcotics trafficking, the adult entertainment trade, and protection schemes, they also appeared in Sao Paulo's Liberdade district, the heart of Japanese-Brazilian life. In 1979, reports even linked members of a Japanese crime group to an insurance fraud killing that ended in a fatal shootout with federal agents near the city of Brasilia. Basically, by the late 1970s, we can say for sure that Brazil wasn't just a curiosity for the Yakuza, it was already operational ground. Then in the 1980s, Brazil entered an economic crisis just as Japan's economy peaked. Suddenly, migration started flowing in reverse. Thousands of Japanese Brazilians, known as dekazegi, moved to Japan for work. And alongside that human movement, illicit trade between the two countries intensified as well. Narcotics, the adult industry, even firearms. In the early 1990s, over 8,000 Brazil-manufactured guns reportedly surfaced in Japan, most ending up in the hands of the major Yakuza syndicates. But Brazilian-made weapons were even used in a 1992 assassination attempt on Liberal Democratic Party Vice President Kanemaru Shin. The links between Brazil and Japanese organized crime were growing stronger and stronger by the day, it felt like. Yet, large-scale investigations into this criminal collaboration seem to have remained rare. Until one incident in 1994. That year, Brazilian authorities uncovered something far more concrete. A bona fide, high-ranking Yakuza figure living comfortably on Brazilian soil. Tanabe Hitoshi, a leader within a Shizuoka-based faction of the massive Yamaguchi-gumi Yakuza syndicate, he wasn't hiding in the shadows, at all. The 32-year-old had a mansion in Londrina that reportedly occupied nearly an entire city block. He lived there with his wife and infant daughter, who, by the way, was born in Brazil. On paper, of course, Tanabe was nothing more than a wealthy Japanese entrepreneur, a car dealership owner, a man planning to build a football school in Brazil for the Japanese youth. But in reality, investigators back in Japan managed to tie him to a large-scale narcotics trafficking operation moving product from Brazil to Shizuoka, where they were able to arrest a trafficker who led police straight to Tanabe. And sure enough, operational bases ran by the Yakuza were then found in both Paraná and, of course, Sao Paulo, as police managed to dig up more and more dirt about Tanabe Hitoshi. The man was found to have maintained close contact with agencies that arranged work visas for Japanese Brazilians traveling to Japan. Then, two young women came forward and told the police that they had been offered the equivalent of $1,800 to travel to Tokyo through one such agency, supposedly as part of an exploitation network connected to the Yamaguchi-gumi gang. Safe to say, all of this was more than enough to eventually get Tanabe convicted and extradited to Japan. For the very first time, Brazil's role in the Yakuza's global network wasn't just a rumor or scattered headlines anymore. It was undeniable. Here's the thing. Brazil was never the easiest playground for foreign crime groups. Just as Tanabe's arrest made major headlines in Brazil, the rise of what would become the country's most powerful criminal organization, the PCC, was already well underway. Then, by the late 1990s, a once again fast-growing Chinese presence in Sao Paulo brought with it increased activity from Chinese criminal networks, whose rackets often overlapped with the kinds of businesses that the Yakuza had been involved in for decades. At the same time, back in Japan, the bursting of the economic bubble and a wave of anti-Yakuza legislation began squeezing organized crime at home. Public tolerance shrank, police pressure increased. Basically, while Tanabe's arrest looked like a dramatic turning point for the Yakuza in Brazil, maybe a sign of bigger things to come, what actually followed wasn't escalation, it was a gradual quieting. But hey, quiet doesn't mean gone completely. Because even into the new millennium, the connection lingered. In 2001, two Japanese Brazilians, Marcelo Fukuda and Cristiano Ito, became involved in a kidnapping that ended in the fatal shooting of a businessman in Nagoya, Japan. The victim had fallen into dispute with a Yakuza syndicate over millions of yen in debt. On September 1st of that year, he was abducted, assaulted, and ultimately murdered. Money and valuables were taken, and his partner was threatened for additional ransom. Fukuda and Ito, both directly involved in the killing, then fled to Brazil, where they managed to remain free for nearly a full decade. It took extensive investigation, witness testimony, forensic analysis, video evidence, and cooperation between Japanese, Brazilian, and international authorities, including Interpol and Brazil's federal police, to finally bring them in. In 2011, 10 years after the crime, and after their Yakuza brethren back in Japan had long been snapped up by Japanese authorities, both Fukuda and Ito were finally caught and arrested in Brazil. They were sentenced to 23 years and 7 months and 22 years and 1 month in prison, respectively. That was the last time that the Yakuza made big headlines in connection to Brazil, the Japanese favorite home away from home. In conclusion, the Yakuza never conquered the Brazilian underworld or anything. They never took over Liberdade or built a sprawling empire across the country. But what they did do was leave behind traces, discrete operations, business fronts, and criminal links that remained largely under the radar. Part of the reason is pretty simple. At some point, there was simply enough trouble brewing back home. Japan's Yakuza faced economic downturns, stricter laws, and rising public scrutiny over the past 3+ decades, which probably forced their focus to be a bit more local. In Brazil, on the other hand, the criminal underworld is fiercely competitive, with gangs like the PCC, rising Chinese networks, and other groups carving out their own territories. There simply wasn't room, or perhaps appetite, for the Yakuza to expand more aggressively. So, the Yakuza's presence in Brazil may never have made headlines like it did back in Japan, or even some other countries, but it is an interesting story of subtle influence, international ties, and the limits of power. A reminder that even in places far away from home, organized crime can leave a mark without ever truly announcing itself. And there you have it, another piece of Yakuza history in the bag. It's been a while. If you want to support the making of these kinds and other kinds of videos, make sure to stop by patreon.com/AniKeHistory, where you can also get pretty much all my content ad-free for just $1 per month. Quite a few incredible people already did so, including the Hockey Gentleman, Saxonfuchs, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lepta, Xoyabu, Tricoat, Kevin Hickson, Buns, Michael Smith, RK0, Hajime no James, Utku Hussein Kaya, Steve Matsui, Hypanen, Javier Sodavia, Midnight Channel, CJ and Mary, Turam, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, White Gilden, Sierran DC, T-Bird, Metal Mama, Boo Boo Cakes, Ian Farmer, Chris Wallace, JR Horse, Journeyman 351, and Adeye Akono. And to everyone who tuned in for this one, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.